I am delighted to welcome Geoff van Sonsbeeck from House of Baukjen and Isabella Oliver, who has agreed this morning to do an interview with us about supply chains, about Baukjen, and how he came into this journey. So, Geoff, thank you for making the time this morning.
Thank you, Sharon. I'm always delighted to talk about our journey and try to inspire people to join us on a similar journey.
So firstly, I want to ask you to give us perhaps a short overview of Baukjen and also how the journey came about.
Yes, I mean, the journey started about 15 years ago when my wife and I were expecting our first son, Oliver, which is also where the name Isabella Oliver as a brand came from. And during that stage, we realized that maternity wear was definitely a gap in the market, and certainly in our view, to do it in e-commerce and to do it what was really avant la lettre slow fashion. We very much believed we need to design high quality that really can have a very long technical life beyond that first pregnancy, second, third, and beyond that. And that was definitely controversial or different. Both e-commerce and both the slow fashion side of it. So we launched with a capsule collection of maternity wear as a pure play company about 15 years ago. And well, you know, quite a struggle to convince people that they should try online. But ever since that grew and grew and was picked up by opinion leaders, influencers, celebrities, a lot of them in the US. And soon that brand had become the recognized premium and quality maternity wear brand. Now I think about 8 years ago, or maybe less actually, we just gave in to the repeated requests of customers to say, well, please, you know, I'm no longer pregnant, if only. And we actually launched Baukjen, which is a kind of contemporary women's wear brand, again, based on the same principles of high quality, trying to not be here today, gone tomorrow in a fashion sense, so relatively classic, and try to encourage by styling and design to allow that garment to be in your wardrobe for many years until it really, you know, doesn't have a longer technical life. And that's what we started, again, pure play, so e-commerce, direct to consumer. And that's now about 6 years ago. If we look today at our business, it's more than 80% of our business is women's wear, which is a fair reflection of course, pregnant women being more of a niche market than women. And typically, the audience we're targeting with maternity, that's quite obvious. With women's wear, I would say, you know, we probably target the 40 to 50 age. But if we really look at our data, it is very striking to see as early as 25, we really start talking about Gen Zs. And we really have an audience being very proud of saying, me, my daughter, and my granddaughter are wearing the same brand, and we look so young and we look so. So I think it's not so much the age bit, but it's more about a look and a feeling of young and sharing the values of the brand. That really drives it.
So I think most audiences know that I wear a lot of Baukjen clothing, and I make no secret about that. In fact, it's probably all over social media about how much I wear it. So for me, and actually everything you've just said, I also wore your maternity clothing when I was pregnant with both my young children. And at the time, your clothing was the only real slow fashion, sustainable maternity wear that I could find sort of 14 years ago. And actually, so I sort of bought very early on. Am I the typical, age aside, gender aside, but am I the sort of typical consumer who's thinking about slow fashion, who's thinking about sustainability? Would you say I typify your consumer, or is there sort of a wide range of consumers who come to you?
There's certainly a very wide range, and we have there's a segment, a cohort that knew us from the Isabella Oliver times, and of course, because of the experience, tend to be quite loyal about women's wear brand into Baukjen. But no, I think we really, I'm daily surprised and encouraged by seeing how we appeal to different cohorts. And particularly since about a year and a half ago, we became a B Corp, and we very much solidified our purpose and our quest to change the sector. And that kind of sense of purpose that comes through in everything we execute in our messaging appeals to complete new cohorts, which is a good thing to know, to see. Because, you know, in the end, I'm in business not just for the profits, but I'm also in the business to drive a change in the sector and in the world. So the more people actually realize that they could and should buy quality, conscious, environmentally friendly, ethically conscious kind of products, the better it is for the sector, because it will instill a change in demand. It will shift the focus of other companies to follow in this direction.
So tell me, we are in very bizarre times across the world. Have you seen a change in buying patterns, purchasing patterns, new consumers or different consumer coming to you during these last 7 months when we've been in lockdown and online purchasing has increased?
Well, like everyone, we've seen a massive drop in trade. People are rightly so having other priorities and rethinking where to spend the time and where to spend the money. And I totally appreciate, I did the same myself. We just certainly see change in if they buy, in what they buy. And again, that is very obvious. No longer office wear or formal, less dresses. It's much more about casual and home and just loungewear, if you like, and above the work top, that's also often referred to. It doesn't matter what you're wearing in tracksuits as long as you look Zoom ready, if you like. So a lot of that has changed, and fortunately, we have very short supply lines, so we managed to jump on that bandwagon quite quickly and effectively. But I see everyone spending less. I would hope to say that I see complete new cohorts coming through, what I referred to earlier. I think at a time of a crisis like the pandemic, people generally reflect more on what's important, what's really important in life. And I'm quite confident that I see that shift to customers start voting with their wallets about brands that are aligned with their value sets. And that's definitely a trend coming through. It was a trend already there, but I think it's amplified. So I'm very positive about that. Again, not just for myself, but for the world. This is a good trend to amplify. So yes, we're seeing a broadening of our customer base. It's at the moment a little bit less deep, more shallow because of the world.
So you and I are both massive proponents of slow fashion, sustainability. I have a question which I think is slightly controversial at times, but do you think we put a lot of pressure on the consumer to make choices that perhaps brands should have a greater responsibility for? And I don't talk about yourself because, of course, you've already had that responsibility and made that sort of obligation. But I'm thinking about the fast fashion world. To what extent do we impose that obligation on consumers to actually make right choices? And actually, should they have to make the right choices?
I think this is a very difficult question. And I mean, I can see the boohoo's of the world and the fast fashion of the world having made use of a demand, of a vacuum, which they fuel themselves. And if you get into a culture of over-consumerism and everything is cheap and it's fine to wear it once or twice and I buy something else because it's cheap, then you end up in the wrong places, and you have to navigate with the wrong ethics if you want to be able to meet that demand. So to go against that grain and say, we need to change that attitude, we need to change that behavior, which typically would be the role for politicians. But in absence of, there are other ways of instilling that change slowly. So I think the consumer, I think there was recently a stat in the last, if I'm right, 10 years, we produce and consume 30% more garments in the world than, which is a ridiculous stat. And I think the other stat is, or there's plenty of stats, but another that really sticks is more than half of the garments are worn less than 1 year. So it is a ridiculous problem. And the only way to truly cope with it is if we're saying we need to deal with that consumerism. We need to steer clear from constantly new, but actually reuse in your own wardrobe or reuse other people's garments and/or rental or subscription models. So let's just extend the life. And that's how we make the biggest impact on the world from a sustainability point of view. But also following sustainability, if the garment will have a longer life, then it will needs to have a better quality, and it generally can be coming from a place where ethics are better secured or better guaranteed. So I think we got ourselves into a problem, and places like Leicester, you know, it was a public known issue. I think to remember that New Look refused to produce in Leicester and got under political pressure. Why do you not produce in Leicester? I said, well, you know, look at it. How can I produce a T-shirt for £2? That means that they don't get paid. Go and have a look. So it's taken much too long for the world to wake up to it. And I think this will hopefully truly stop this problem in the UK, but it's not the UK. It's much wider. It's anywhere. It's, you know, and it goes in many disguises. It's not just how the factory looks, but it's how they get paid or who they pay else for it, and what for hours they work and what standards they have. It's a global problem. I'm going a bit off on a tangent here, but these are all things close to my heart.
No, I agree, and I everything you say there is very pertinent, because of course in the UK we have the Modern Slavery Act, which came in 2015, and I myself only just recently talked about this as to the Leicester issue, of course, has arisen for many years. And it's not just specifically to Leicester. We know there are other pockets within the UK that also have this same issue. What is interesting is that it's taking us so long, notwithstanding that we have legislation in this country, to sort of spot these issues and actually do something about it. So I'm going to, and we are going slightly off tangent, but I'm going to ask you another question here. So in terms of having that legislative framework, why do you think, and this is your very personal opinion, and I'm not asking you to say this in any sort of other form, but why do you think it hasn't been as effective as it should be?
I think it's in the end greed. It's trying to meet a demand, an insatiable demand for cheap garments. And if you want to feed it, you need to find a cheap place. And that's what happened. And that was agreed on both the factory side as well as the brands that were placing the orders there to make that happen. And unfortunately, that's, you know, ingrained in humans' kind of characters to try to make use of that. It's of course not this example. I was reading earlier an extensive article, completely different, about the whole Wirecard affair in Germany. And, you know, you could hardly have been more in the political and commercial kind of spotlight as a DAX listed company, and getting such sustained criticism and research and investigative questions, and still right in plain sight of government bodies overseeing it, being bullied away, really, until obviously the House of Cards fell apart and it all turned out to be exactly as expected. It's hard to explain this. I think it's often right in plain sight when it goes wrong.
Do you think financial penalties would be more of a deterrent if they had been included in the legislation?
Yes, absolutely. They would have worked, because it deals with greed. Greed will be an assessment of risk and reward. And if the penalties are linked to it, it would have helped. So
I want to thank you for that. I'm sure we could talk about this for a long time, actually, because there are so many flaws in the legislation and the framework and enforcement.
It could also work the other way. Maybe, sorry if I jump in, there is a counter argument that, and I'm just making it up as I am here, but this whole push to green and being ethically sustainably good company, you know, what is the role of the government? Do we need to limit bad behavior, or do we need to encourage good behavior? That may also help a lot of people that carrot to bring them over the line to become a greener, more ethical, more sustainable company with better practices. And perhaps it's the reverse of it. You know, maybe people want to be eager to demonstrate that they are a good company to get into that special, whether it's a financial reward or a badge of honor or an accolade of any sort that is preferential. That could work too.
And Geoff, you make an extremely good point there, because when we originally formed Justice in Fashion our whole ethos was not to actually bludgeon the brands and sort of, you know, aggressively harass them and say, this is what you should do. I think there needs to be a fine line between encouragement, but also maybe a sort of modicum of, if you don't do, then this will be the actual, you know, detrimental effect. For a long time, I think sort of we relied on the reputational aspect. So, you know, if a brand doesn't adhere, thus their reputation will be tainted somewhat. My cynical view is I'm not sure people care enough about reputation. Again, I think we go back to the cheap clothing, the demand, etc. But I think if there's a form of encouragement to brands, as you say, that sort of carrot, and not always, I'm very much, I have this dichotomy about this, because I think brands need some sort of financial penalty, but not so harsh that actually it just becomes a punishment, as opposed to an encouragement that actually, you know, if you do X, Y, and Z, then we go to, you know, for a better future and have a better future. But yes, I think it's a very complex, it is a very complex sort of structure, in that we're trying to impose upon consumers, we're imposing upon brands. My personal view is that also investors need to take more of a stance.
Yeah.
And, you know, in their process of due diligence, and in the way they're thinking about what they're investing in, that they need to look to the brands or to their industries or, you know, companies that they're investing in and say, right, what are you doing in order to fulfill, you know, X, Y, and Z, or adherence to sort of ethical and transparent framework. So yes, no, we could talk about this for a very long time, I think.
For a very long time, but I would say the latter is definitely something that has gained a lot of traction in the last 6 months during the pandemic. Yeah. Reading the papers, listening into discussions, that's been a resounding message. The shift from institutional investors to actually take these values into considerations. Yeah, so I'm quite pleased with that. Need to see whether they see it through, but that's definitely happening.
So you yourselves have clearly placed a lot of emphasis on being a very transparent entity and being incredibly ethical. I want to ask, how easy has that been in terms of sourcing suppliers, maintaining transparency, maintaining that ethical stance?
Well, first of all, you know, how do you measure whether someone is ethical or is green? I don't think anyone can, and it's definitely prone to misuse. But I would definitely say we aspire it, and we're doing our best every single day in the decisions we're making to be as ethical and sustainably possible. And I think that's what you got to look for. But you know, if you want to do it, it has to come from the heart. And you know, if it's not there, if it's not sitting there between the leadership of a business and investors for that reason too, and the team itself, then it's not going to be able to actually convincingly be broadcasted and executed accordingly. So in our case, you know, it was there already. So that's easy. You know, the starting position was there. But you know, I think a lot of people, certainly in time of crisis, will wonder, this is the wrong time to do it. We need to tighten the belt, and should we actually do less? It's very easy to skim on higher production cost due to ethical choices, or due to fibers and fabric choices and production process choices, and to just tighten the belt there. Or in any other way on how you deal with it. We went the other way, and I'm a strong believer that if you lead with these values, then that will be reciprocated. People, whether it's your suppliers, your customers, people around you, they recognize that, and they will reward you for it. And so we've been undeterred in that direction of walking, and actually stepped it up during the crisis, when by its definition, people needed more good things to happen and not less good things to happen. So, and we've been, I think, we recognize now that actually customers are recognizing that message more so than they did before. So I think it was the right direction, but it's not been easy. You know, difficult choices. yes, and how to protect your people, how to take care of your suppliers, how to protect your customers during a time of pandemic was quite a challenge too.
And can I ask your supply chain? I'm assuming it's a very small, short supply chain, in that when we see sort of other brands, they have a multiple supply chain that goes through sort of many conduits. You have talked about in other discussions we've had about having a very short supply chain, which means you can maintain that transparency. Without sort of divulging too much, where do you sort of source from? Where do your suppliers come from?
Well, we're actually very open about it, because I think you should. And we, by and large, it's Portugal. Right. About 20 factories in Portugal that we talk about as well on the site, and we are in the process of even being much more open about it, to actually really share who they are, what they stand for, what are their accreditations, who else produced there, to just get a feel to the customer about, well, being transparent. And yes, it's Portugal, and we're doing that for a few reasons. We're doing it because we are able to turn things around much faster, which means that we can order the right product and get it in the right time, in the right place. Whereas if you have longer lead times, that's a problem. We also do Portugal because it's bloody good quality. And the work, ethics and the legislation around it, being part of the EU, safeguard us from a lot of the problems that we otherwise may be much more prone to. But I have no illusion, beyond the first tier, things will get opaque. We know the dye houses, we know the mills, and then we're tracking all the fibers as deep and as much as we can, right to the bottom, basically back to the farm. But the global fashion industry is truly a huge maze of transport from one country to another continent and back for hair, and it's a ridiculous process and very hard to pinpoint. So yes, our tier ones are largely in Portugal, and I'm talking about 95%. But once you get to the raw fibers, they're coming from anywhere in the world. Well, not anywhere. We actually very much know. For instance, we full-heartedly know we have no Chinese cotton or anything that comes from those areas. So we absolutely blacklist certain combinations that we do not want, because we know that they may be causing trouble.
And to actually go back to a point you've just actually made about always being 100% ethical, I think you touched upon the fact that one can never guarantee that. And I think that's for that very reason. One might be able to see where their suppliers are and safeguarding that, but you can't always go beyond the sourcing of materials. And it's an interesting conversation that we've had recently with other brands. They say, well, you can't always with certainty say where my materials are coming from, or do I necessarily know the mills in which material is being produced. So I think you're right, we do use the word ethical quite loosely. Yeah. And sometimes more thought needs to go into when we're asking a brand to be ethical, what is it that we're really defining that to be? Just to pick up on Portugal, and you talked about the safeguards of the EU, and I digress slightly here, but thoughts on Brexit, will that have an impact, do you think?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen with Brexit, but right now, our internal assumption is that we have about a 75% chance that we will fall back on the World Trade Organization, which will not be good. And of course, it's expensive, from duties and fees and commissions and administrative delays and processes to get products into the country. But I'm much more concerned about what it would mean for the demand and the economy, kind of another hit here in the UK, and what the consumer behavior will change in that respect. But beyond that, just from a pure supply chain, it's frustrating, it's expensive, it's more complicated, but that's it. Not much more will change.
And you wouldn't ever contemplate moving supply within the UK to domestic market?
Not at this moment. I struggle to find places where that can happen without trouble. You have some artisanal places where you can do some very specifics, not at the scale where we're producing right now.
I suppose that takes us back full circle to the Leicester issue, doesn't it? I think, and something that I have recently been discussing with others is the lack of transparency and lack of unionisation in this country, which is very ironic given that in developing countries, that's what we are pushing for and what we're pushing brands to adhere to, yet within the UK and domestic market, it seems to be harder to implement that.
Yeah.
And yes, I think you succinctly have sort of, reflected the issues that are occurring within the UK. I suppose why brands are somewhat reticent to obtain supply from factories here. In terms of new initiatives, because I know we've discussed new initiatives that Baukjen are sort of going to be putting in place. Can you share any of those new initiatives?
Well, I think a lot of them are literally on our website because we talk about them. But we're pushing in a lot of areas, and really I believe is that we said earlier the role is for the government to make a change in this sector, which we need. We need a systemic change. We need a real game changer to ensure that we are delivering on our green targets as a world, and as a sector for sure. And I think what we're doing is we're trying to demonstrate that there is a complete new way of looking at the fashion sector and the models in it on how to serve the customers' wishes, because in the end we all like to dress ourselves into nice clothes, and it's part of our well-being, and we full-heartedly believe in that. So we're going to have a footprint in the world, that's a fact. But the question is more, how can we limit that footprint going forward? And in that respect, we've taken a stance that there is a lot of areas where you can innovate the processes. So that starts really on the design side. As I alluded to earlier, we've been kind of slow fashion from the beginning and say, it needs to be classic and timeless. It needs to be on trend, but not gone tomorrow. So we need to provide customers with garments and styling ideas, how they can get true mileage out of a garment over a longer term. Sustainability also includes how do you design into it, what are the fabrics, what are the factories, and there's so many changes that are possible. And we particularly take a stance on they need to be fibers that have a lesser eco footprint, whatever the attribute is we're trying to optimize here. But really at the same time needs to allow for longevity of the garment, because if we extend the technical life, then we actually make the biggest impact. We actually reducing how many garments we're producing, and that's how we get into a better world. But beyond that, so now we have produced a garment that has a much longer life than the average garment and is produced more ethically and sustainably conscious. From there, we say care and repair is really important, and by however we got here, we all are washing our garments too much and too warm and totally wrong with the wrong detergents, and in that process we're damaging not just the garment, but we're damaging the environment. And here too we've taken a stance and say, listen, we need to educate the customers, and we need to provide them solutions on how they should actually take care of garments, and what are the right detergents. And we're partnering with experts in this area for microfiber filters, and what are the detergents that actually are environmentally friendly and actually do a good job. So there's a lot of work happening around that side. From there, we're saying, but the garment doesn't need to be new when you wear it. You could share it. You could have a rental model, you could have a subscription model, you could have a second-hand model. And we've launched an array of initiatives on that side, on the re-commerce side. And we truly believe that's where the future will go. Design a garment that can last long, and actually allow people to steer away from ownership of a new garment, but look at different models. And then lastly, we're working with our largest factory in Portugal on a mechanical recycling. So any garments that are coming back to us because the customer doesn't want them anymore, and or we can't do anything with it because of the state, we mechanically recycle into high quality fibers, new yarns, new fabrics, and they feed into our model. So we're very circular in that respect, and we truly believe that the future going forward is design products that are having a long life, push for e-commerce, so maximizing the use, and then in a considered way do the recycling back into the same fibers. Across that, you're talking about everything we just talked about it. We're also a great believer of transparency, and this is a big initiative we're working on. You know, we're members of, as I said before, we're B Corp, we're members of the Fashion Pact, we're members of the SAC, the Climate Coalition. There's a whole range of them, and we don't just do that to collect this batch and look at us, but we're doing it because we can tap into research and work done by others about getting transparency about our supply chain, about fibers, about use of it, about production, and a whole range of other things. And we've brought that together in a blockchain technology, and we are now linking that to every unique garment to tell the customer, give them visibility on as much as we at any time are capable, and that is down to how much information we can gather, whether it's from recognized sources or anecdotal, to give you the full story of that garment. So back to what we said earlier, the cotton is not coming from China. We know that, and what do we know? We know, for instance, it came from a certain region in Turkey, and if we're lucky, we know exactly the farm, but these things may be hard. And then we can link that story back. How much did that farmer get paid? What do we know about the processes made? Was he organic cotton, or is he BCI cotton, which is actually, he's in the process of becoming an organic cotton farm? And what do we know about that? And that's a whole story that we think that if we start sharing that with customers, with the sole reason for them to actually start getting interested in it and actually start asking questions to other brands, that we will instill a kind of bottom-up change to the sector, and create a demand for better practices, better fabrics, better footprint, and steer the customer to the behavior that we should need as a sector. So actually, so many projects, I could keep going on, and I'm going around it, I'm thinking already forgot that one, I forgot this one. We often say our circular model is the message. This is what we believe. There is a different way of doing fashion, fashion 2.0.
So that is all quite phenomenal. It really is. And I think in this day and age, customers are becoming more inquisitive as to where is their clothing coming from, where is my material coming from. I recall in recent times, H&M had decided to do something where you could look at a barcode when you go into their shop, in days when you could go into shops and buy, and actually sort of see to a certain extent the factory from which it was produced, etc. Again, my slightly cynical part of me says, well, that's fine, but unless you're a very savvy consumer that will go and look at that factory, and that factory is then on a list which, you know, is saying it is adhering to all worker rights, labour rights, social enterprises, etc., it becomes a harder concept, because in theory it's a nice idea, but actually doesn't go far enough. I think what you're explaining goes so deep that the consumer will be able to see, well, actually this is the cost of my piece of clothing, and I can see in the chain how that's been allocated on a price point, and also how that's been sourced and through whom, and I just think it's quite a phenomenal piece of information that consumers can go away with, and sophisticated consumers will say, this is great, I can clearly see now that workers are being paid a living wage, or actually the farmers are, you know, are sourcing, or sourcing organic cotton, for example, but are also being paid a fair amount for that cotton. I think from my personal perspective, that's always been the missing link, not to be able to see how and whom is making my piece of clothing. And again, I've recently said, and it's probably conversations I have with my own children about this, when the supply chain is so long and so far removed, it's easy to say out of sight, out of mind. And in years gone by, when my mother used to make our own clothing, we knew exactly who was making it, not necessarily where the material was coming from. It normally came from the Indian shop in our town. But the time and effort my own mother put into making our own clothing, it was there. She was the artisan, she was the creator. We didn't go any further than that. And then she sort of passed those skills on to myself, and I passed those skills on to my daughter. Now I make no false promises that I'm very good at sewing, but I can still sew. And I think actually that's also become a very lost art in this generation.
Totally.
In our generation certainly, and in the future generations. And it's interesting that that's now coming back full circle as well. We're now talking more about upcycling. Again, I'm not a proponent of TikTok, but I understand on TikTok there are lots of young people embroidering and, you know, redoing clothing, and so I think we've come back to a point where something that was lost sort of 30 years ago is now slowly coming back, because we're rethinking our whole concept of clothing.
I totally agree. I think the relationship with the garment has become a more emotional one, which is really, really key. So I'm very hopeful about everything I pictured before, 30% more garments, and how hideously we take care of it and have no idea where it came from, and it's got to be that cheap. I think that is really, really changing, and it's coming through. And of course, you know, my customer is not yet the Gen Zs, but that's the future. So if we can just already educate them, you know, I have no illusion they're not buying from me, but I'm trying to reach out to already share with them that there is another way of doing fashion, and that, you know, there is a role for the consumer to be demanding and to be educated in it, and then demand the right behavior. Because as they come through and they get closer to my target audience, and not just my target audience, but everyone else's target audience, that will be the beginning of change. So it's a vital thing, but I'm hopeful about it. Yeah, and what you're saying earlier, you know, I said earlier, the care and repair is important, and I went into the care about washing and how to do it and longevity. But the repair is just like that. We need to get back in mending of garments, because it's a fact of life. Sometimes a zip does come loose, and how do you fix it, or a button? That doesn't mean that the garment is gone. You just need to repair it.
And yes, and in lots of situations it's very easy to say, well, I'll just discard that garment, because if it's a cheap garment,
yeah,
it's easy to dispose. You know, it's lost 2 buttons, oh, I won't bother sewing it, it's too much time, therefore I'll just go out and replace. So yes, it's a whole changing of the mental thought to clothing, isn't it, I think? Yeah. I know I've taken up a lot of your time today.
Oh, no, keep going.
I know, we can talk all day. I suppose my last question is, when you sat down originally all those years ago and wrote it on a piece of paper, this is what I want to be doing, and you know what, this is what we're going to do, have you achieved what you originally set out to do?
That's a very interesting question. I think right originally, by a mile, we never thought that the business would take off as quickly as we had anticipated. So it overtook immediately reality. So that was, you know, right in the first few years, my whatever had aspired had been overtaken. But I think it's bigger, you know, over the last few years, where I changed my horizon was not the size of the business or any of that. It was the emotion of what I just talked about. What can we do by changing the sector? And that mission shifted, and also gave me and everyone around me almost a new lease of life in terms of how excited and driven we are about it, because that's now the objective. And that's, you know, that remains this, I wouldn't call it mirage, because I think we will get there, but it's always on the horizon, and we need to keep going. And the journey is very exciting, it's very rewarding, it's very challenging at the same time, but we've got to keep going, and we've got to get as many people as possible on that journey. So in that respect, no, and that's a good thing, because there's much more to do.
Geoff, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. And as I say, I could talk to you for hours on end, but Geoff from House of Baukjen, thank you very much for giving us your time today.
Sharon, anytime. Talk soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.